Welcome to the Flash Finds podcast, the world's fastest podcast where we explore how Facebook can help you with the stuff you're into. I'm Emma Rogue, joined by Nathan the Cat Lady, a Facebook creator. So Nathan, if you're into pets, what kind of stuff can you find on Facebook?
Well, I make reels about useful tips for pet owners. For instance, cats don't like still water, so all of my cats have cat fountains.
Oh my gosh, that's so cute. What a great episode. See you next time on the Flash Finds podcast, all about discovering the stuff on Facebook you care about. Bye.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to unearth some of the core principles of our mad, and sometimes quite corrupt world.
This week, we're going to pick up my conversation from last week with Tom Burgess, the award-winning investigative journalist. So if you haven't heard that episode, please go back to last week's episode. Is corruption and kleptocracy at the very heart of the enduring disorder? We're not going to be re-examining or setting the stage of all the background themes. We're assuming that you've listened to that episode. That will allow us today to delve more deeply into the murky dealings of Mohamed Amersi, one of the British Conservative Party's biggest donors, and the man who is the subject of Tom Burgess's most recent best-selling book, Cuckoo Land, Where the Rich Own the Truth. Amersi is very interesting in his own right, but to my mind, even more interesting for what his story reveals about our era of global enduring disorder. Alex, last week I was surprised to learn that the telecoms industry was as corrupt and offered as many opportunities for kleptocrats to enrich themselves as these other industries that we think of as more corrupt, like mining or oil and gas and stuff. But it was useful once Tom explained it, because you can understand that the telecom industry is a natural monopoly. Once the government awards a license to one company and not others, that company can pretty much charge whatever they can get away with, because people need telephony and internet service. They can't say, I hate this company. I'm simply just not going to have a cell phone. And if in a country the government gives one license to one company to build the cell phone towers, that's a natural monopoly. And I like Tom's metaphor that he explained to us, that the telecoms industry is like a neo-medieval toll bridge. If you sit at the entrance to the bridge and you have your guard and chainmail, anyone who comes to the bridge, you can say, hear ye, all who wish to pass the bridge will have to pay a fee. And then when they pay the fee, you collect that fee, and it's well known that those medieval guys in chainmail, they called their lawyers in the city of London and said, could you please wire this to my account in the Cayman Islands? That's how all the medieval toll bridges worked.
And as you're mentioning that, I'm thinking about some fairly similar kind of toll bridge scenarios in the UK, like the supply of water. Because you buy your water from the local water company. It is a monopoly. You can't go and get your water, unless you dig a well, I suppose, and go back to the village square and haul up water yourself. You are bound to get your water from the company that has a monopoly on the water distribution. And so the role of the regulators becomes really important. And sadly, as we have seen in the UK, the regulators are not doing a good job. You only have to read all the stories about sewage in the British water systems. It's quite disgusting. And so in this episode, we are actually going to take, no pun intended here, a deep dive into, I know, that came out of nowhere, a deep dive into the murky waters of British access, influence, patronage, and corruption. And we're going to look at the specific case of the Anglo-Asian lawyer and huge Tory party donor, Mohamed Amersi, who gained his wealth by acting as a middleman to negotiate huge contracts between Western telecoms companies and third world countries. On his website, the Amersi Foundation, he is described as, quote, a renowned global communications entrepreneur, philanthropist, and thought leader. However, he has become notorious in certain circles in the UK when it became apparent that his negotiation of massive telecoms contracts with certain countries, including one in Uzbekistan, allegedly involved payment of massive bribes to family members of the ruling elite. And he has been able to use his money to buy access into elite establishment circles in the UK. He's a large donor to the Tory party. He has been able to have private meetings with the then Prince Charles. All of this facilitated by the elite private concierge company known as Quintessentially, which is run by someone called Ben Elliott, who coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, was at Eton with Boris Johnson, is the nephew to Queen Camilla, and was for a time chairman of the Conservative Party. This is the murky world of connections, of buying access, of paying to play in elite circles, and this is what we're going to hear more about in this interview.
Yes, one of the things that brought Mohamed Amersi to larger public awareness is that he tried to set up an association called COMINA. And it was to supplant CMEC, the Conservative Middle East Council. To make this happen, he bullied and then sued for libel the former Tory MP, Charlotte Leslie. However, for the victory of truth, he didn't win his court case against her, which opened himself up to a book like Cuckoo Land being written about him. Because although Amersi was the plaintiff, in other words, he initiated this court case, that forced him to do all sorts of disclosures, to say lots of things on the record, and to have his lawyers, Carter Ruck, which is a famous reputation management firm in London, allow people like Tom Burgess to speak to Amersi and to scrutinize his claims. So I began by asking Tom Burgess to explain to me exactly why shadowy power brokers like Mohamed Amersi emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and why it was that these kind of power brokers were needed in telecoms deals in specific.
What the book demonstrates about Amersi is a remarkable ability to connect people with shared interests, including himself, and to find people across very different cultures and legal systems and political systems. They say they want all sorts of things. The rulers of Nepal will say they want to bring future technology to their people. The bosses of TeliaSonera and other companies like that will say they want to bring freedom and prosperity through telephony. Mohamed Amersi states very, very high and lofty goals for himself in transforming the world. In fact, these days he calls himself a diplomat and visionary peacemaker. But what they certainly all have in common is an urge, which they are very good at satisfying, to become incredibly rich.
Right. But on the question of becoming incredibly rich, I'm just trying to sketch for people who are not as in the details as you or I, why middlemen or why corruption or bribes or anything like that is needed. Let's say I'm the Uzbek or Kazakh government. Why not just have an open tender process, have a parastatal company, a semi-sovereign institution, sometimes called an SOE, a state-owned enterprise, just reap all the profits from the telecom sector. And then, because we're the government, we control how that pot of money is spent, and we can appoint my nephew to run it, or we can invest it how we want. I don't understand why in a post-statist system like Libya or any post-Soviet place like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, why do you need bribes? Why do you even need middlemen fixers?
Let's put ourselves into the mind for a second of your Central Asian kleptocrat, faced with the choice of keeping the tendering process for telecoms or oil or mining or defense contracts secret and personally controlled, or having an open tender. Thinking as the kleptocrats for a second, it seems like a complete no-brainer, doesn't it? Of course, you maintain secrecy because it allows you to extract rents from that process. I mean, it's as simple as that, isn't it?
Okay. What kind of realities was Amersi trying to deny and then rewrite? What was he trying to use, this purchase of access for?
I think even after these years of trying to understand Mohamed Amersi, he is still quite a difficult person to understand. But I think what's quite clear is that he aspires to be among the highest in the land. And that is for sale. A place in the establishment is for sale. He himself describes it as access capitalism, where the very heart of power, the very heart of democracy, the very heart of representation of the will of the people, access to that is not available to the people en masse. Far from it. It's available to the highest bidder. And what is Amersi trying to achieve? I think he wants to be among that elite and perceived to be worthy of a place in the elite. I don't think he would say that there's anything wrong with the way he made his money. He certainly wouldn't. He would say every dollar he's ever made is clean. But there's certainly a contrast between the places where he made his money and the regimes that run them. I'm thinking about the Maoists in Nepal. I'm thinking about Putin's Russia. There's a contrast between those regimes and how the British regime would like to see itself. And you get to buy into how the British regime would like to see itself, which is essentially, and this is the result of centuries of largely kind of imperial thought, as the moral summit of the world.
How does this connect into the British establishment through donations to the Tory party, to the Prince of Wales's trusts?
Well, what is it that the British elite controls access to? Why would you enrich someone in the British elite who could give you privileged access to what commodity? I think it's probably best to describe as moral superiority. That's the commodity. That's the oil. That's the coltan. That's the airwaves. That's what's for sale. And if you find someone like Ben Elliot, who is the nephew of the now Queen, went to Eton with Boris Johnson and runs a thing called Quintessentially, which is a kind of concierge service for the 1%. And, we'll get you your slippery elm tea bags helicoptered to you, or get you access to the Sydney Harbour Bridge to propose, or dinner on an iceberg, whatever it may be. What he'll also sell you is a slice of British moral superiority that you can put on like a cloak. So he will get you access to the royal family, and he will get you access to the top floor, which is the Conservative Party. And you can buy your way in there with staggeringly few checks if your money can come from states that are a mortal threat to the UK in many ways, like Russia. But you can use that money to buy your way into the Conservative Party. And in arriving there, you get to buy your own little piece of British moral superiority. And crucially, that's also for sale, maybe less spectacularly, perhaps more importantly, in the legal system.
I think you're onto something that for people who are not in the game, they might not grasp how pay for play and pay for access and pay for status works. So when I was the executive director of the U.S. Libya Business Association, I was frequently shocked at how high-ranking Libyan officials, ministers, deputy prime ministers, head of semi-sovereign institutions, would want to have a meeting where they give a pre-prepared speech that everyone knows and then take questions where they barely give the right answers with some lobbyists from corporate America, from Fortune 500 companies, or then would love to meet with the Libya desk officer who's like a junior official in their late 20s at the State Department. But the reason that they wanted to have these things set up for them is then they feel, I'm meeting with this American official and I'm in D.C. in this lobby on K Street. And fascinatingly, they would make their time and they would prepare and they'd have their speech in Arabic when it's all just for show. But it's the perception of like, we get the photos. I had this meeting in Washington, and that's something which the companies are willing to pay member fees to have. And then the Libyans are willing to go out of their way and make these trips to Washington to feel that they're both at the summit of power or legitimacy.
Right. And I mean, just a brief thing to add to that, like that, it all depends on which of two ways you believe power works. And maybe the way you're describing is the more realistic, actually, that it works on personal connection. Whereas how we would hope it would work would be in a sort of depersonalized way of institutions apportioning resources and access and opportunities to, let's say, access to government contracts on the basis of merit. And when we go to work in the telecoms regulator of whichever country or in the courts of law or whatever it may be, a political party, we see ourselves as serving in a sort of impartial, impersonal way the interest of society. But obviously, in a the more kleptocratic the system gets, the more that is just a facade for personal interest.
To move on, let's talk about pay-for-play schemes rather than just pay-for-access. A lot of how I understand corruption in Westminster is you donate X to an entity to get to meet with a certain minister, to play tennis with Boris Johnson, to get preferential access, to get a knighthood, or to get in the House of Lords. And then, like with the situation with Lady Moyne, at a later moment, that may be useful for you in getting some kind of no-bid contract. As an American, this strikes me as interesting in many ways. One, the British system seems so permissive because it's very insular. Obviously, there's pay-to-play in the US, but the amounts are larger. The getting to know the correct person is harder. You've needed to know them. You can't just get to the meeting so easily. And then we have the FARA registration process, meaning that anyone who's taking money from a foreign sovereign or semi-sovereign entity has to be registered. And of course, you can pay for access, but it's all known that those meetings are happening. So in the British sense, is it that there's just a tiny, tiny network of a few Etonians and the people who are so wealthy that they pay for this quintessentially service and can meet the British elite, that the corruption is the very insularity of it that makes it unique?
No, because I think we're maybe in danger of mixing up Britain and London isn't really British at all. London is just global. These institutions, sure, are British political institutions, but the hundreds and hundreds of peers, lords, ladies, and so on, they rent out, some of them, that moral superiority globally. So one of the best examples is if you can use this pay-to-play to navigate your way to the peerage, give enough money to the Conservatives, let's say, or Labour in the past, you could be Sir Jason, or even Lord. And one of the best things you can do with that is take it to a FTSE 100 company board. And let's say I'm an oligarch who's got hold of a Siberian coal mine. I want it to look like a legitimate global corporation rather than something run on kickbacks and shotguns. Then having you, Sir Jason, on the board is worth a lot to me in terms of my ability to access lawyers, banks, finance, real tangible things. And for that, I will pay you a lot of money. And the other point is, as well as the London Stock Exchange, and that being a way of converting a place in quite an insular British elite and small British elite into kind of global payoffs. That's one part of it, the London Stock Exchange. The other is the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is a really anachronistic offshoot of the British Empire. But actually, there are networks there that are still really, really strong. And there are gatherings of the heads of state that are huge jamborees for lobbyists. And again, so that is another really fertile way of getting your return on your pay for play within the British establishment.
What I want to ask you is who benefits from having this corrupt system endure? Is it the disorderers? Is it the neo-populists? Is it the neoliberals? Is it the libertarians? Is it just the elites who like to feel that they have moral superiority? Because this feels so out of place for mid-21st century, globalized, technological, where we're at now.
I would say this is a disorderly boomerang. So what you've had for centuries is the UK exporting its disorder, whether that's to Calcutta or to Kenya or wherever it may be. And this elite has been able to keep the sins by which it thrives out of sight. I mean, principally that was through the slave trade, colonialism, and so on. But then in the sort of post-imperial periods, broadly speaking, I think you moved into a sort of corporate empires run from the LSE. So a lot of the power of the empire was just essentially privatized into companies like Royal Dutch Shell and the big mining companies and so on. And then there was this enlightening. I think maybe it started on the day that Litvinenko was killed in London in 2006. It certainly didn't lead to a huge awakening then, but maybe that was the first stirrings. And the real horror of it came home on the day that Putin marched his troops across Ukraine. And this was, I read about this in the book, it was really brilliantly pieced together by the Intelligence Committee of the UK Parliament, who wrote what was called their Russia report, which Boris Johnson suppressed for a long time. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a man who has been so thoroughly cultivated by rich people close to the Russian intelligence services. And the boomerang I'm talking about is the realization that the UK, the elite in particular, the establishment in particular, have not simply been exporting corruption, but more recently importing it. And what we've realized is there's a massive national security risk to this kind of having this kind of wide open, internationalized, pay to play elite. So whether it's through access to the legal system, access to political parties, and through them, the top of government, media ownership, those would be the big ones. And not just media ownership, but use of the private intelligence and PR industries to distort the media. In all those ways, these institutions that underpin the freedom that the UK so cherishes are being corroded by precisely the kind of corruption that the UK used to push out. It's now breathing it in.
So you sketch these interlocking pyramids where London sits at the top, and what the empire used to do is to export corruption and import wealth, and now it imports corruption. But is this normal? Is every country like this, that globalized big dirty money needs to flow into it, and that whether it's Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands or Malta, one of the things that the West and that the rule of law and beautiful old buildings provide is the ability to attract people's dirty money to them? Or is the UK unique in that it is a major country with certain reputational advantages and certain tax haven aspects that make it completely novel?
It's not completely novel. There are a handful of countries that are the sort of world, the clearinghouses for dirty money, or more usually for one aspect of it. So you might have somewhere like Liechtenstein that's really good at sort of banking secrecy. Switzerland, obviously the same. Or you might have some of the Caribbean islands that are good at doing kind of shell companies. You might have certain parts of South Africa that are very good at yielding mercenaries, and so on. All these things form the ingredients of the global kleptocracy. What the UK has, and why London is the global hub for dirty money, is it has so many of these things, right? It has financial centre, it has a functioning, well-regarded legal system, but one that doesn't check the origins of the money that uses it. And it has that kind of moral superiority industry, right? It has the kind of reputation laundering industry, whether that's your ability, the ease with which you can buy a peerage or so on, or access to the law firms and the media and so on.
So let's double down here. You're really good at telling stories, and you have this great example that the moral superiority industry plus the ability to use the British courts, that's a bit of a secret sauce. So I found the most breathtaking part of Cuckoo Land, where the rich own the truth, was your own conversations with Mohamed Amersi, both at his lawyer's offices and via quoting his libel trial against Charlotte Leslie. I found the libel trial with Charlotte Leslie fascinating, but I'd like to push back a touch. You're very critical of Amersi's self-presentation, but fascinatingly uncritical of Charlotte Leslie's self-presentation. You seem to see Charlotte Leslie as a victim. Now, I need to make clear, I've had a lot of run-ins with her over the last 5 6, 7 years. And I see her as representative of everything that's wrong with the Tory party, everything about why the Tory party was ripe for capture before Brexit by the neo-populist right, even by those members who are not of the neo-populist right. Because the David Camerons and Charlotte Leslies, they're not neo-populists, but the way they run their affairs, the for sale sign was out there on the lawn, and then it just happened to be that the neo-populists purchased it. So I think it's really important in nuancing your story that I see her as exactly the same as Amersi. It's only a question of scale. So what I wonder about the scandal is that Amersi is obviously more tainted than Leslie and much more of a bully and wealthier, but they represent the same part of the kind of Tory money machine selling influence and then repackaging that influence through multiple vehicles so that it looks more legitimate than it is. And it's like, wow, this is, they met a perfect match. I mean, it's like Greensill and Cameron. Leslie is of the exact same vibe as this whole thing.
Well, I think that's certainly what Mohamed Amersi would say. And that is pretty much his position, or pretty close to it, I think, on Leslie. I mean, throughout this process, back to the first time I interviewed Amersi, he's been making allegations about Leslie personally and CMEC.
Having worked on this Middle East influence in Westminster piece and the 10 years that I've been in the UK, I'd like to do another little pushback on page 158 of the book. You write, Conservative Friends of Israel is better funded and better connected than any other lobbying operation at Westminster, with 4 and 5 Tory MPs being members. Obviously, no one disputes that 4 and 5 Tory MPs are members. I found this statement a little bit dangerous read in a post-October 7th universe, and I know the line was written well before then, but I feel like the Russians, the Emiratis, and the Saudis have infinitely more money and influence sloshing around than the Conservative Friends of Israel. So I wanted to draw you out here on the question of just degrees of influence, that when I look at the US, AIPAC is a powerful and well put together institution, and there are a range of other Israeli-aligned bodies that are important. But when I look at London, I see Gulfi money and Russian money prior to 2022 is ruling the roost and dwarfing any kind of essentially peanuts that the Conservative Friends of Israel can do to influence British policy.
I'd say that is the analysis that I got from some, what seemed to me well done, well-researched reporting on CFI and its history, and the sheer breadth, I think, of its ability to attract Tories as members. But I would say that the CFI is held to be very effective in the breadth of the Tory party that it can find support with.
I want to pivot now. Let's order the disorder together. I think you and I are concerned with really so many of the same questions. How we got to here, how do we get to a position where Western government institutions are so permissive to corrupt money, and to where the rule of law has become so, for lack of a better term, inshittified? How did we get to here, Tom?
Yes, well, that's the term that struck me. I was listening to your other episode recently about your extraordinary struggles with the UK car insurance industry. And, this process of inshittification of, I thought you just defined it very well. You're going to remember the term more accurately than I did, but essentially is the breakdown of an institution, an industry, an organisation into the kind of petty self-enrichment, would we say? Something like that?
But it has to do with market capture, just to define it very precisely for our listeners. The key thing why inshittification is a term that interests me so much is, let's look at a platform like Twitter or Facebook. It initially provides a very novel service for free or at a good value for the customers. The customers like it and come. Then the power of the customers and what they like is taken away, and it provides it in a really good way for the advertisers so that it can be monetized. The customers are then monetized. And then in the final analysis, the whole thing is inshittified. It's no longer good for the advertisers or for the customers, exactly as has happened for Twitter and Facebook. Value is clawed back for the platform, and then the whole thing is just a complete waste, and it has so many externalities. And that's the enshittification value cycle.
Well, maybe the comparison doesn't quite work, but I think there is something to it of looking at what has happened to the UK legal system. If, depending on how you see it, if the UK's greatest strength, and there is an argument for this, is the rule of law, and that is the most precious thing the UK has, and I think that's probably fair to say, and I think there's a lot of countries where I've lived and worked that would kill for the UK's rule of law, or certainly people outside the ruling elites would. Alternatively, if the UK's rule of law is the commodity that's now for sale, is the bedrock of the moral superiority that's for rent, it is going through this process of enshittification. If you look at the criminal law, which is what's supposed to keep us all safe, supposed to keep us all out of jail for crimes we didn't commit and so on, it's in complete collapse. The system is broken down. The system of legal aid, which is surely a marker of a decent society, having a proper system of legal aid, so that anyone accused of a crime can get a decent defence. That is completely broken down. The system of paying criminal barristers is completely broken down. There are people doing extraordinary important works listed as barristers on immigration law who can barely get by themselves as a result. And meanwhile, the civil courts are going absolute gangbusters, right? It's Vegas in there. Tens of billions of pounds a year of revenues generated from civil litigation. And the UK is the forum of choice, the courts, but also to some extent the private arbitration courts. The High Court, the business courts of the UK are the location of choice for oligarch versus oligarch warfare. And you could argue that no one wins in these things. This is just people who've grown very rich in kleptocracies or their British allies fighting disputes over who gets the biggest share of a dirty fortune. Now, if that system is broken down for the customers, in other words, the British citizenry, it's definitely working for those who are making life-changing amounts of money out of it, which is the global law firms. Now, there are some brilliant people in there doing some brilliant work, but it's also true that there are, especially in reputation management, simply vast sums being made out of crushing free speech.
100%.
That's one of the reasons I was so interested to write Cuckoo Land. And I think that viewed as a whole, the UK's rule of law is collapsing in the areas that aren't funded by vast civil litigations, and in those areas that are, enormous trials are taking place, sometimes over the conduct of lawyers and how much lawyers' fees should be, where the content of those trials is corruption in poor, far-off lands. But that's not what's on trial. What's on trial is the aspects of who should behave in what way within the legal system, who should get what payout within the legal system. And it seems to have lost its way.
I'd like you to order the disorder with me, though. What can we do as citizenry who want to vote and who want to be in societies more ruled by truth, justice, and the rule of law? What do you suggest for people?
Well, the thing I always say when asked questions like this is that I'm a reporter. So I think it's important for reporters to simply try to document what they find, regardless of whether that leads to any idea about a solution, or regardless of whether one might think that things are fixable. That said, this does expose me to lots of people with very interesting ideas, and I think that one central thing here is to return to cherishing the rule of law as an idea in itself. I think that that's been so neglected, and it's neglected in all sorts of ways in the UK, from the current debates about the Rwanda bill, to the collapse of legal aid, to the way the courts are abused. And I think we are starting to twig that there's a connection between preserving the rule of law and preserving freedom, which is something that I think not too long ago would have been obvious to everybody, but we've lost sight of. And I think a return to realising the sheer importance of that. And perhaps even more profoundly, I think after 3 books that sort of one follows the other, you do end up with Orwell, thinking that the freedom that underpins all others is freedom of speech and its attendant freedom of thought. And I think for all sorts of reasons, ranging from technological change, facilitating disinformation, to generative AI and the devastating effect that's probably going to have on our ability to check the authenticity of all information that reaches us, to the rise of the reputation management law firms trying to crush the free press, to the talent with which Putin and the Chinese Communist Party's disinformation operations have developed. On all of these fronts, freedom of speech is under attack, and also from cancel culture and culture wars and so on. It's hard to see a more sort of perfect storm against freedom of speech. And I think that is what we have to remember, that is the heart and bedrock of this freedom.
From your mouth to God's ears, we as individuals and as a society need to cherish the rule of law, and we need to cherish free speech. In your view, and again, I understand that you're a journalist and you're not a policymaker and you're not even a policy advisor, but I'm just interested in your thoughts. What actions could be needed from a public policy perspective to help tackle kleptocracy and then the global disorder which we experience over here in the US and UK and Europe as a result of kleptocracy that happens over there in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Nepal?
Yeah, but it's circular. I mean, it's circular, right? I mean, these are Western corporations paying bribes in Uzbekistan and then Uzbek money coming back into the UK system and corrupting it. It's a big circle. But what's to be done about that? I do have thoughts. I mean, I think it's so clear in a way. And you see it in all the problems with the widespread use of sanctions, taking the UK, which is responsible for oversight not only of the sort of the probity of its own corporations, but of their behaviour internationally. So those who would resist corruption in the Niger Delta or Angola or Kazakhstan, they're not going to find accountability through their own institutions, because those are shadow institutions at the mercy of kleptocrats. They're going to find that through the institutions that police the corporations that do the corruption. So the law enforcement agencies of Western Europe and North America, right? In that sense, billions of people depend on these law enforcement agencies, not far beyond just those of us who happen to live in these countries. And what you have in the UK, and to a lesser extent in the US, is a magnificent set of statutes against corruption and money laundering, and indeed fraud. In the hands of law enforcement agencies, they've got the right name, they've got some talented people in them, but what don't they have? Any money. They are hopelessly outgunned. Again and again, we get situations, they sort of often hop between civil and criminal cases, but you get situations where corporations and oligarchs just financially outgun, outmuscle the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency, by ludicrous factors to make the fight completely uneven.
And I want to jump in here saying that this is a rare example of something the US does slightly better than the UK, because it is embarrassing how little the forces of good get paid in the UK inside the civil service. Whereas if you're a district attorney in the Southern District of New York, you're getting a reasonably decent salary and a lot of, shall we say, social capital, whereas in the UK, you're not. And therefore, you're so outgunned by the forces of evil that, of course, they're able to walk around them. And I'm wondering if, in addition to, having more taxpayer money there, can we collect bounties? Can we have institutions that seize corrupt Libyan and Kazakh and other money and actually give it to the people who are trying to fight corruption?
Yeah, I think, that's how the DOJ does it, isn't it? Essentially, the fines that the Department of Justice is able to bring in through corruption cases and so on, they go towards the Department of Justice's budget. And that could be a very helpful change in the UK. It's also definitely true, speaking to lawyers in the UK, some very experienced ones, they describe something exactly like you do, about the kind of the social capital and the good wages you get from being, let's say, an anti-corruption prosecutor in the US. There is nothing like that in the UK. And if you want serious talent to be attracted to working at the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency and so on, then that would be hugely helpful, one would think. And I think there's a chance of that changing now that I feel like in 2016, the US saw the connection between national security and kleptocracy because of Trump. A guy who was a massive threat and remains a massive threat to US national security and was fed and fattened by kleptocrats. In the UK, we've only just woken up to that with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was when the connection was made between, we've been absorbing all this money from the former Soviet Union. Well, surely there's nothing wrong with that. What could possibly go wrong? And then suddenly the link has been made to the armies of a kleptocrat marching into Europe. That realization is happening. And I think, therefore, there's an argument that can be made on everything from protecting the courts from abuse to properly funding, let's say, the Serious Fraud Office and so on. You can make an argument now that is a question of national security, not just, let's say, a moral question or one of foreign policy. And that makes that argument stronger. And I think there are people around the presumably incoming Labour government who understand that.
After the break, Jason and I are going to try and order the disorder.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
Alex, Tom's terminology about the British establishment selling, quote unquote, its moral superiority, it's quite damning. How do you feel about this? I mean, in your life, not only as a British diplomat, but as someone whose upbringing in career has had you rub shoulders with this establishment much more than I ever have. How do you feel about how he explained and put this vis-a-vis Britain's role in the world?
I felt like a live oyster having salt and lemon squeezed over me. I winced and cringed because it is such a powerful insight into how the British leverage our smug class system. The idea that you have a sir or a lord or a lady on the board of your establishment, of course that opens doors. And it is really troubling that in 21st century Britain, how you present yourself, how you dress, and how you speak still opens doors. And it is still all based around this idea of the British gentleman and the upper classes and the royal family and tea parties and knowing the right way to serve a cup of tea and to pour a glass of champagne. And of course, it's all nonsense. I mean, the British upper classes are full of rogues and scoundrels and cads and rotters, and Boris Johnson being exhibit number one, but books are written about these characters as well.
But maybe it works, Alex, because it wasn't always complete nonsense. Britain might have been among the first places in the world where the rule of law actually worked, and that these upper orders were, up to a time, willing to engage in public service. I think a key thing to push back here is that in World War I, the officer class died in the trenches at a much higher rate than the enlisted class, and that people with fancy accents and titles did used to dedicate their lives to public service at a much higher rate than on the continent, so that in France and Russia, you had revolutions against the nobility, against the class system, and you didn't in England. So it's a shame that today, when I don't see many Lord this and Sir that fighting in Helmand province, they maintain a veneer of flying in helicopters over Helmand province and, we're helping out. But I don't want to damn everything about this, because the system exists and has the connections that it does, because there was a time when people did look up, not cynically, to their upper orders, because those upper orders were, to a large extent, publicly minded.
Yes, I don't want to condemn everybody and say they're all rotters and cads. Let's just say it has become debased, the currency, not least because you can now buy access to privileged circles. And this led me on to thinking that another phenomenon that you touch on in the interview and that is new in this world is the severing of the connection between the governing ruling elite and the sort of masses in the country. So you have Theresa May talked about these citizens of nowhere, these kind of international elites, and she was talking about it in a very derogatory fashion about sort of the intellectual elite. But I think it's a more accurate description of the sort of mega rich elite who holiday in the Mediterranean, have islands in the Caribbean, travel to the South Pacific, and they live in a sort of a different sphere. And there is a severing of the connection between the interests of the elites and the people who are their neighbours. And I think that's what's happened with the UK is we've hollowed out industry. We don't make things, we sell things, we sell services, we sell, as Tom said, moral superiority, respectability. We sell legal aid, we sell reputation laundering, we sell access. So there are all these sort of different strands that are coming into play. But I think this severing of the connection between ruler and ruled is another phenomenon that's new, that may be why it's making this worse.
100%. And it is that perception of that severed connection which leads to neopopulism. Brexit and the Trump phenomenon are the wrong solution, but they are pointing to the real problem, which is this conception by many of the have-nots or passed by modernity that somehow the people, we, the us, the majority, are no longer connected by either values or style of life to these uber elites who govern us or take the majority of the wealth from our societies. And that is a tragedy that is not going to be fixed anytime soon.
My goodness. Let's try and order the disorder, Jason. I'm going to ask you the question, what do we need to be doing to tackle this?
Alex, how do we solve the enduring disorder just in one line at the end of an episode? Well, I got one for you. Electoral finance laws. I think Citizens United is really quite important in the US, and the flow of dark money in the electoral system in the UK, although of smaller amounts, is quite important. This isn't a be-all and end-all, but I just want to toss out something that I think can be quite helpful for how easy it is to bring about. If you could just block the connection between money and electoral campaign financing, you would not have such an overrepresentation of the moneyed interests in legislation. And we used to be able to do this by, for example, stricter campaign finance laws and, disclosure of how dark money and dirty money slosh around the American political system. So that's my first really easy low-hanging fruit. If Keir Starmer comes into power and he has a majority of 50, literally you could pass legislation where you can understand how campaign finance monies come about and just say, well, this money is just going to come from taxation. We don't allow political party donations to buy ads and do this and this and that. It's like, this is not rocket science. I think that is low-hanging fruit on the national electoral finance level. And I'll toss out one on the global level. I am all about coordination, Alex. The answer that I say to the global enduring disorder, and it doesn't matter if it's about corruption or the war in Ukraine or climate change, is we just need to make sure that the major democratic countries coordinate their policies. If Britain and the Crown colonies and the EU and French and EU overseas territories and America, and meaning places like the state of Delaware, had the exact same rules, so there was no regulatory diglossia, meaning gaps between the way things are regulated in one place as opposed to another, that would be a huge step to fixing this. I don't think you need to strong-arm the Kazakhs or the Swaziland government to tax things differently. Just get this big three, the EU, the UK and its dependencies, and America to have uniform corporate taxation, uniform disclosure and shell company disclosure, beneficial ownership rules, and uniform on all this stuff, we would be 90% there, and you could do it with a stroke of a pen in Brussels, Washington, and London all at once, if they wanted to.
But I mean, Jason, that's quite interesting because there was an agreement reached about 2 years ago, and really maddeningly, and I'm sorry, listeners, I can't remember which forum it was agreed in.
No, this is the G20 agreement that Biden passed on taxation, and Ireland agreed, but it just hasn't really come into implementation.
Yes. So they have, so that is one way in which they're trying to tackle that. And then for years, there's been something called the Financial Action Task Force, which works out of the OECD, that has a whole host of initiatives on trying to identify beneficial owners of companies, trying to clamp down on the use of shell companies in offshore locations. I mean, I was working on this in the 1990s out of Washington, and we used to cooperate really closely with the Americans about the UK's overseas territories and the US Virgin Islands. And we used to try and coordinate with the French and the Dutch as well, less successfully. And in fact, that was one of the things I used to advocate for, was that we all needed to work together rather than separately. But there were and are and continue to be quite a lot of efforts to clamp down on the use of shell companies or offshore tax havens to hide money and resources and to prevent you seeing who is the beneficial owner of a company. So I think quite a lot is taking place. I think the real challenge is just, these are highly complex, highly sophisticated financial instruments. And the companies and traders and brokers who are running all these schemes have masses of money and really talented lawyers on their books. And it is really hard to prove your case against them. And as fast as we regulators can come up with new initiatives, they will be one step ahead of us. I did quite like this notion, and again, I saw it when I was in Washington, that the Department of Justice is allowed to seize the assets of drug traffickers, and that those assets go back into funding new investigations and new teams of investigators in their drug squads, anti-narcotics squads. And we should definitely have the same in the UK. I don't know if anything like that exists on a small level, but we should be allowed to recycle the proceeds of crime. We need to resource these jobs properly. I mean, you were saying with Tom, a junior investigator in the UK probably earns very little and is up against these big companies. It's the same with sanctions. Why haven't more people been sanctioned in the UK? Why haven't we been able to bring more court cases against some of the oligarchs who've placed their money? And it's because our British legal system is overwhelmingly stacked in favour of the defendant, which makes sense in some circumstances. You don't want to penalise innocent people, but also means the burden of proof is incredibly high, the threshold for bringing sanctions against individuals. So the Magnitsky Act, which you have talked about extensively, which was a tool introduced to sanction corrupt elites in Putin's Russia who are found to be guilty of human rights abuses. We have this act on our books in the UK, but very, very few cases have been brought because the burden of proof is so high. So these are all things that need to be tackled. If you have the political will to do it, if the government really drilled down and worked with top quality lawyers, I think they could strengthen these instruments and they could allocate the resources. So it's not impossible to tackle these things.
That optimism is key. It really is possible, Alex. And my answer to why haven't global powers coordinated to make systems of financial order more comprehensive and more enforceable is it just wasn't seen as important. They had the wrong ideology. The global enduring disorder came about in a world where we had vanquished the Soviet Union and the big state. And hence the overarching idea was communism and state structures are bad, and deregulation and letting the free-for-all of the markets is good. But that isn't actually what winning the Cold War was about. The Soviet Union was never about communism. It was about authoritarianism. And we have never really been about a free-for-all of just money can buy anything. We've been about rule of law. So we missed the plot. Our leaders never tried to create a global financial ordering institution. No one ever thought of making a NATO for taxation or a NATO for kleptocracy. But maybe if they, the powerful, are listening to the Disorder Pod, they will think we shall create the NATO for taxation and kleptocracy. That is more than enough from me, Alex.
And it's certainly enough from me. So thank you everyone for listening. If you want to keep joining us on this journey of trying to order the disorder, please tap follow right now wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be notified when every episode launches.
For more on today's episode, please subscribe to our Substack. It's free. You can find the link to it in the show notes, as well as more background about Tom Burgess's really brilliant book, Cuckoo Land, Where the Rich Own the Truth. And as always, we need to end by thanking
our producer, George McDonagh, and our executive producer, Neil Fearn.
Thanks for listening. We hope you have an orderly and corruption-free week. Talk to you later.